Hi, everyone. My name is Joshua Yang, and I am a journalist with the New Journalism Collective. Together with Marta Leira, I'm sitting here today with Hillary Davis, who is the New Voices coordinator at the Student Press Law Center, and Kristin Taylor, who is the director of the Scholastic Press Rights Committee at the Journalism Educators Association. We're happy to have you, and let's jump right in. So we wanted to talk about prior review, and it makes sense then that the opening question would be, what exactly is prior review?
So prior review is the practice of requiring generally student journalists to give over their work prior to publication or distribution, usually to an administrator. Sometimes when we're talking about colleges, it's to the public relations team or anything like that, for the purpose of reading an article or seeing a piece before it's put out in the world. There's mandatory prior review, and then there's strongly suggested prior review. And people like to split hairs about that. But either way, it is giving the work of student journalists over to somebody else who's not from the newsroom to evaluate before it goes out in the world.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that other than to say that the moment that prior review becomes prior restraint is when when someone is reviewing something, they say, "Oh no, I don't want you to do this," or they ask for changes. That's where the tipping point is.
Yeah, thank you. And what are the implications for prior review or prior restraint for student journalists, or really just for all students?
Well, the first implication is that the administration or anybody else doesn't trust the work that the student journalists are putting out there, think that for whatever reason it needs to be evaluated by vague, external, very rarely talked about standards that may change from time to time. Very often what happens is that administrators or others will read an article with concerns in their mind and will come back to student journalists and say, you can't put this out in the world, or you should change this for whatever reason, or I really think you should be thinking about this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of implications for that. The first is simply that it's messing with the journalistic integrity of the piece. A journalist has put considerable time and energy into researching a piece, writing a piece, producing a piece, thinking very hard about what it is that's going out there in the world. And then someone comes along and says, I don't like it, you should change it. Which not only is terrible for the student journalist, terrible for the community because it's editing out very often important information. And it effectively asks student journalists to act as the PR wing for their school, which is extraordinarily problematic for a lot of reasons. We've seen some really gratuitous and strange censorship that comes out of this situation. There is clearly no reason for prior review. If an administrator has a specific concern about a piece, they can absolutely make that concern known to student journalists, to editors, to advisors in advance, but there's simply no reason why this should be taking place.
I just want to add the one other thing I think that's problematic about prior review is that it also leads to self-censorship. Sometimes students won't even attempt to cover a subject because they know that an administrator, for example, is going to see it and say, oh, that's going to make the school look bad, or that's too controversial. So I think it also just has a quelling it just really quells the story in the first place. It doesn't even let the story get its legs often.
Yeah, absolutely. A student journalist should be writing a piece with, the only thing in mind should be reporting the truth, reporting it accurately, not reporting what's going to be popular for whatever administrator happens to get their hands on it at the time.
Right, absolutely. And I was just thinking a parallel you could draw is if there were prior review for professional journalists, all of that important investigative work, the story on Trump's taxes, for example, none of that would ever be printed.
Yeah, thank you. And then just what can students and student journalists do to end prior review or to work towards overturning it?
Oh man, the first thing is just to talk to each other about this, either to share experiences or talk about your own concerns. The big thing that perpetuates censorship is just that everybody is too scared to talk about it. Student journalists often feel like either whatever they feel like happened maybe didn't, because they don't know if they've been censored or not, or that they did something wrong. And so in talking with each other and discussing these situations and realizing that, one, it's not okay. Two, it doesn't have to be this way. Three, other people have dealt with it. You're not alone. And four, it really impacts your community when you're censored. That's number one, the very first way to really get things done.
Yeah, I so agree with all of that. And the only other thing that I want to add is I really think what is the tipping point for some schools is that conversation with the adults in the community, is really helping them to understand what student journalism is, what goes into it. I remember, because I'm at a private school, so we did not have any type of guarantee, even though we're in California, which has amazing New Voices press freedom laws, but we weren't protected by the main law. So part of what we did was we looked at our school's mission. And even in public schools, there's often some sort of a mission statement or some sort of a statement of belief of values of the school. It almost always talks about making students better critical thinkers, making them leaders, making them like responsible members of a democratic society. These are all things that student journalism is perfectly situated to play into. So I think talking about how student journalism is the embodiment of those values really helps. Talking to them about how you think through ethical scenarios, talking about how just because you can publish doesn't always mean you do, that you're always balancing the idea of like seek truth and report it with minimize harm. I think that is a really important conversation to have with the adults in the community so that they understand that it's not just a bunch of quote unquote kids getting together and writing whatever and then putting it up. I think sometimes adults have a very cartoony idea of what student journalism is, and they don't understand how complex and how thoughtful and how careful it is.
Yeah, and the other thing is to just remember, we throw student in front of student journalists, but you're journalists. You may not be professional journalists, but you're journalists. And we all know that as local media becomes less and less available, that student journalists are covering the things that used to be covered by your local paper, by your community news organization. There aren't education reporters. There are only student journalists in a large number of communities across the country. And right now, as we are all at home and student journalists are the only people who know what's going on in the schools, you're the only education reporters. And that kind of stuff is really critical, not only to your school, but to your community as a whole. And the more you talk about what's happening and the more you talk to other people in the community and make them aware, the more support there really is out there for student journalism as a whole, because nobody is going to know if your school building is falling apart but you. Nobody is going to know if something feels weird in the way your school is being run except you. Nobody is going to know what it's like to deal with active shooter drills or mental health issues at school or anything else but you. And so those stories are critical and need to be told, even if they're very scary to you, and even if they make your administrators a little bit uncomfortable. And just always remember that there is a whole infrastructure that's here behind you to support you. And then it doesn't have to be this way, and you don't have to do this by yourself.
Absolutely. All right. I think that's all Martha and I have for you today, but wow, this was a great conversation. And to the rest of our viewers, TNJC will be putting out more free speech related content this entire week, October 19th through 25th, to coincide with a celebration of free speech in a democracy. Thank you, and we'll see you later.